Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the expansion of our Archdiocese of Boston Catholic Records project. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Director of Education and Online Programs here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be moderating today's event. We are a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Giving today's presentation is Molly Rogers, Database Manager for Digital Projects at American Ancestors. Molly works on our database collections, maintaining the accuracy of current databases, and managing teams of volunteers to transcribe and add new collections. Originally from York, Pennsylvania, Molly studied English and French at Colby College in Maine and has a master's degree in library and information science from Simmons College. So since 2016, American Ancestors has been digitizing and making available the sacramental records of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston. Now, more than 3 years into the project, we're expanding the scope of the program to include records through 1920, as well as some new record sets. Today, we'll share some background on the project, how to navigate the databases that result from our digitization efforts, and provide some additional resources to better understand the history of and the experiences of your Catholic ancestors in and around Boston. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question in the panel to the right of your screen. We'll address those after today's session. And there is no handout for this presentation, but we are recording this event, and starting tomorrow, you can easily go back and review any of the content from the presentation on our website. So if you missed something on today's first listen, don't worry, you can always go back and review the presentation. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Molly.
Hi, I'm Molly Rogers, and I'm excited to discuss our partnership with the Archdiocese of Boston today. We'll focus on the sacramental records from 1901 to 1920, the latest expansion to the project, as Ginevra mentioned. I'll begin by looking at the history of the Archdiocese of Boston. What was it like to be an early Catholic in Massachusetts? How did the experience of Catholics change as we move into this 1901 to 1920 time period? Then we'll dive into the two databases that we're creating and how to search them. We'll briefly look at other helpful resources to consult in your research. I'll conclude by applauding the volunteers who work on this project and letting you know how to stay up to date on additions. The Diocese of Boston was officially formed in 1808 out of land that used to administratively belong to the Diocese of Baltimore. Two French priests fleeing the French Revolution were instrumental in establishing the Catholic Church in Boston, Father Francis Matignon and Jean-Louis Lefebvre de Chevreuse, who would become the first bishop of Boston. Obviously, the state of Massachusetts was founded by the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who were trying to distance themselves from the Church of England, which in turn was a reaction to the Catholic Church. Initially, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in Massachusetts. Here I have an excerpt from John S. Sullivan's book, 100 Years of Progress, which was published in 1895. This is a sketch relating to the history of St. Francis de Sales Church in Charlestown. Sullivan relates how Protestants of Charlestown were opposed to the new Catholic Church. He says, "In those days, when Catholicity was not fully understood and even hated in Massachusetts, the good people of Bunker Hill were horrified at the idea of a Catholic Church rising on that classic ground. It was not uncommon for Catholics in the 1800s to face opposition when buying land to erect a new church, or even for them to deal with possible cases of arson as they built these new church buildings." Irish Catholics in the United States did face a fair amount of prejudice throughout the 1800s. By 1900, I think it was more accepted to be of that religion and that ethnic group in America. Things such as serving alongside other Protestant Americans in the Civil War contributed to them becoming more accepted. So 100 Years of Progress, as I just mentioned, is an excellent source of information on the early history of the Archdiocese of Boston. It was published in 1895 and is available online through the Internet Archive. It includes sketches on the history of parishes that were established at this time and can provide really helpful information on how a parish evolved. It often says, before this parish was established, the Catholics who lived in this area might have traveled to this church to worship instead. So you can sort of trace how a parish grew and where your ancestor might have been baptized or married, etc. It's not particularly objective. It sort of has almost a propaganda tone, but it can be a really great look into that time period. So early Catholics were struggling to establish their church and gain acceptance in Massachusetts. How did this story change in the new century? In the 1910s, the highest number of immigrants came to Boston. About 40% of the population of the city was immigrants. Nationally, there was this large preoccupation with the number of immigrants coming into the country. Congress created the United States Immigration Commission, which was also known as the Dillingham Commission for its leader, William Dillingham, to study immigrants across the country. In 1911, the Dillingham Commission produced a 41-volume report. The findings of this report were heavily influenced by the xenophobic fears and attitudes towards race at the time. However, it did represent some of the ways that immigrants positively contributed to the United States at the time, and it was the largest study of immigrants' lives that was happening. Ultimately, the findings led to restrictive immigration policies, including quotas for certain countries. But this map here came from the Immigrants in Cities portion of the report, where they focused on the city of Boston. So they've mapped different ethnic groups and where they lived in specific areas that were studied by this study. You can see Italians in the North End and Lithuanians over here in the Seaport, and a group of Polish immigrants in South Boston. So I don't think that this is 100% fully representative of who lived where. I know that there was a Polish church that was established in the West End, but it shows you some idea for where people lived in the city, and that, America as a country was concerned enough about this problem to create this 41-volume report. The History of the Archdiocese of Boston by Lord Sexton and Harrington is a great resource for learning more, especially for those later years that aren't covered by 100 Years of Progress. It has a much wider scope. It's not just sketches about specific parishes, but it also contains a more wide-ranging look about what was going on in the Archdiocese of Boston in this pretty large time period. So this is a 3-volume work, and you can view it online through HathiTrust. So the years 1901 to 1920 also included a leadership transition for the Archdiocese of Boston. John Joseph Williams was the 4th Bishop of Boston. He was appointed in 1866. In 1875, he became the first Archbishop of Boston when it became an archdiocese. When he died in 1907, he was succeeded by William Henry O'Connell. O'Connell in turn served from 1906 to 1944. He was the first Archbishop of Boston to become a cardinal. William's tenure largely focused on combating anti-Catholic sentiment and making a place for Catholicism in New England. Cardinal O'Connor worked from that base that Williams built to turn the Archdiocese of Boston into a force with global influence. Cardinal O'Connell was better educated than previous bishops of Boston and had closer connections with Rome. In 1908, he made a famous speech that sort of reflected on the state of the Catholic Church in Boston at that time. He both reflected on the past and looked towards what the future would look like. He talked about the divide between Protestants and Catholics in Massachusetts, and in the history of the Archdiocese of Boston, they sort of characterize his speech as almost conciliatory between the two religions, but I think that this phrasing is a little bit strong. He says, "The Puritan has passed, the Catholic remains. The city where a century ago he came unwanted, he has made his own." So I think that these tensions haven't totally simmered down in 1908. He also looked towards the future. He said, "The child of the immigrant is called to fill the place which the Puritan has left. He must learn to fill it worthily and well. The pitting of race against race is a base maneuver. The Catholic Christian will not countenance it." So in some ways, he's preaching about tolerance and inclusion for all the new people coming to America, but he also has a pretty heavy tone for assimilation, when he says they have to fill the place worthily. So I think in this time period, they were sort of seeing how is the Catholic Church and Catholicism in Boston reacting to what was going on at this time period. The world was also changing rapidly. Internationally, political upheaval and natural disasters drove people to immigrate to the United States. Industrialization was disrupting traditional ways of life, driving people to migrate. There was the Great Flu epidemic that happened in 1918. World War I broke out in 1914. Prohibition was enacted in 1919. So the world was sort of just on the edge of the modern era, and the degree to which these large-scale events affected the personal life of your ancestor is absolutely going to vary, but I just wanted to sort of draw to attention some of these things that were going on at this time in which they lived. You can sometimes see evidence of these events in the records. Here we're looking at a baptism record that was recorded at St. Bridget's in Framingham. The priest was an army chaplain who served in France during World War I. He baptized about 7 men from Massachusetts while in France that must have recorded them in this parish register upon his return. You can see here that Clyde Clifford Johnston was baptized in the same baptismal font as Joan of Arc in Domremy, France. Of course, I'm really fascinated to learn more about what led these men to convert. What was it like to be in France in World War I at that time? But we'll have to do more research to figure that out. So I've just provided just the briefest overview of the different challenges and circumstances that were faced by Boston's earliest Catholics compared to the Catholics of the 20th century. Now we'll dive into the project itself. What are we creating? How do you access it? What is new? We'll see. We began working on this project in October 2016, digitizing sacramental records from 1789 to 1900. We officially announced the project at a joint press conference with the Archdiocese of Boston in January 2017. We continued working on the project, and in February 2019, we announced a related database, Boston, Massachusetts, St. Augustine Cemetery Records, 1819 to 1859. It was created for the 200th anniversary of St. Augustine's Chapel and Cemetery in South Boston. This was the oldest Catholic cemetery in Massachusetts. We'll talk more about it later in this presentation. In August 2019, we had the really exciting announcement that we are continuing this project and digitizing the sacramental records from 1901 to 1920. So that's really what we're trying to focus on today, to celebrate and tell you more about this second phase of the project. And as we go, we keep working to bring more and more records to you. This project has proceeded in 2 phases so far. So as I just said, we began with the sacramental records from 1789 to 1900, which encompasses about 820 volumes. We'll discuss our 2 different databases that we're creating in a minute, but the image-only database for phase 1 is currently complete up to 1900. We're still working to make all of the phase 1 parishes available in our searchable database. We just announced phase 2 this summer, and we've begun scanning new volumes in December. Ultimately, we'll add about 724 new volumes spanning 1901 to 1920, but this number is still an estimate. I'm continuing to work with the Archdiocese of Boston to determine the full scope of Phase 2. So the final product of this project are 2 databases, and ultimately they're going to have the same information in both. The Massachusetts image-only Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston records 1789 to 1920, I'll probably colloquially refer to as the image-only database throughout this presentation. It's fairly easy to produce. We scan a set of volumes and then put a parish online, compared to our searchable database where we do a lot of work to index it and make it easy for you to search. So this database is free to NEHGS guest members. Right now we have 886 volumes available, which includes 190,000 pages, 156 parishes, and 77 towns, which includes neighborhoods of Boston in that number, like South Boston or Brighton. So we're really excited about the volume of information we have available in this database, and I'll go through in detail how to search it a little bit later in this presentation. In the searchable database, we do a lot of work to try and make this easily searchable with a high quality index. So right now, we only have 584 volumes in this database, but that still amounts to about 2 million records. So a record is roughly a sacrament. So someone was baptized or someone was married, that would be a record. Then there are 7.5 million names available. So each record might have any number of names associated with it. If you have a baptism, there's the child who was baptized. Hopefully you have their parents' names, the witnesses to the baptism. So that's how that names number adds up really quickly. This works, as I said, the way most of our databases work. You can type in a name and get taken to the page on which it appears. And so this is available to full NEHGS members. So if you want to learn more about becoming either a guest member or a full member of NEHGS, on our homepage, there's the Join/Renew button. And so you can learn more about the benefits of each of these types of memberships. So what will you find inside this database? It mostly contains baptism, birth, confirmation, and marriage records. There will be a few First Communion records and a few sick calls. In the earliest records, there are just a few ordinations. We don't have any reconciliation records, as this is, of course, personal between the priest and the parishioner. These records can be really helpful in your genealogical research for a variety of reasons. If for some reason your ancestor was not captured in civil vital records, you may be able to find them here in the church records instead. If your ancestor does have civil records, it's possible that the church record might have captured different information about them. You might have more information regarding the parents' names, their birthplaces, maybe their current address at the time of the record. A confirmation or First Communion record can act as proof of residence in a certain location that could be helpful for locating families during those 10 years between censuses. You might also find different spellings of your ancestors' names that maybe you hadn't thought of before, that if you try searching them in a database, maybe you'll find more records than you had before. So the records really vary in format and the information that was recorded. Each volume is going to have something that is different. So we'll look at a few different examples and you can see what that looks like. One of the biggest questions we get about this project is, what does the Archdiocese of Boston mean geographically? It is not just the city of Boston, it's actually a fairly wide swath of eastern Massachusetts. So the diocese extends north to New Hampshire, west to towns like Marlborough and Hopkinton, and all the way south to places like Plymouth and Rochester. So we'll dive in with how to search the image-only database. It more or less functions like a set of online books. You're going to have to flip through it to find what you're looking for. There are three ways that you might search this database. A book might have a physical index. The record keeper took the time to create an index in the front or back of a book. There might be an index in a separate volume, so you'd have to consult that other index volume, then return to the volume in which you're interested to find that record. And then finally, and unfortunately, a book might not be indexed at all. So we'll go through some examples of each of these three scenarios. Using this database can be a bit unwieldy, but right now, while we're still building both of these databases, it's definitely worth consulting even if you are a full member, because depending on what you're interested in, we might have a little bit more information available in this database at this time. So the best place to start, whether you're searching the Catholic records or anything else on our website, is our homepage. Whether you are a paying member or a guest, you want to make sure that you are logged in to start. So up here in the header, you can see it says Welcome Molly. It's going to say Welcome your name. And so then you'll be fully logged in to be able to access whatever you want to look at. So we're going to start by clicking on Browse Databases, A to Z. So this is going to take you to a list of our 465 databases. You can search this list by keyword. So here I am in the search by database name box, and I've used this keyword Archdiocese. So now in this list, I have the three databases that we're talking about today. So to browse the image-only collection, I'm going to click right here on the database title. So now we are on the database-specific search page for Massachusetts image-only Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston records, 1789 to 1920. So this is going to allow us to browse these images. In the search tips, you can see this link right here to a video that I've made explaining how to navigate this database. We'll go through the whole process right now. So you want to use the volume drop-down menu, and you can use it over here in this box. In this example, we're going to work from the Browse This Database box. It really doesn't matter which one you choose. So let's expand that volume drop-down list. Here, we're going to choose Holy Trinity Boston Baptisms, 1902 to 1908. Holy Trinity was the German church located in the South End. I just added this volume that we're going to talk about as part of our Phase 2 update to this parish last month. And as we'll see, this will be an example of a book that has an index within it in the front of the book. So we're going to click Browse, which is just underneath this dropdown, and that will take us to the first page of the volume. So here we are on the first page of Holy Trinity Baptisms. The first page of each volume in this database should be called Index. You can see that here in the page number box. And this is created by us here at AmericanAncestors.org to help you understand how to navigate the volume. This volume, as we mentioned, has a physical index. So this chart down here should help you easily navigate that index. So for each letter of the alphabet, we've said, all the A names are going to appear on index pages 1 through 3. So I've chosen to look for Gertrude Anna Kohler. And so you can see here, it's a little small, but the Ks are going to appear on pages IND_23 and IND_24. So up here in this page number box, you're going to type in IND_23 and then hit the Enter key on your keyboard. So now here we are on index page 23. I've zoomed in on the image, and to do that you can use these plus or minus buttons in this upper corner, or you can use the scroll wheel on your mouse or maybe the trackpad on your laptop. So I've zoomed in and we can see here she is, Gertrude Anna Kohler, should be found on page 20. So now we're going to go back up to that page number box, type in page 20 and hit Enter. So now here we are on page 20. You can see her baptism happens to be the one right at the top of the page. And I thought that I would go through this format. It's this Latin form that is really common throughout these registers so that you have a little bit of understanding of what's going on here. You shouldn't be intimidated by the Latin, especially this form gets repeated over and over again. So if you know what you should be looking at, it's pretty easy to decipher. So in this column, the nomen familiae, we have her last name, and in this case, they've also given us her first name. If you're just skimming a page to see where the record that you're interested in is found, you probably want to center in on this column. Next, we have the month and day of her baptism. And unfortunately, there is no year written in at the top of the page. You can see over here for her birth that we'll get to in a minute, it does say 1902, but you don't want to necessarily assume that this baptism happened in the same year. Often, of course, they did get baptized within that short time period, but you can't always count on it. So you would want to page back a page or two until you find that date at the top of the page. So I tried it in this example. I think maybe you only have to go back 1 or 2 pages to see that we are actually looking at the year 1902. So then diving into the meat of this record, it starts with saying ego infrascriptus baptizavi. And so that's going to mean I, the underwritten, baptized. And so that's referring here to Joseph Busam, who is the priest who signed his name under each record. So that's what the underwritten means. And now we have her name Gertrudum Annam Latinized. And so in the searchable database, you'll see that we try to provide an anglicized alternative for all of the Latin names in the database. We don't want to require you to know that Gertrudum is the Latin for Gertrude. Obviously, in this case, it's pretty clear and simple, but there's a few other names where the correspondence isn't immediately as obvious. So she was born Natam the 18th day of October in 1902. This Natam section can be really helpful if the Latin is unclear and you're not sure if you're looking at a record for a girl child or a boy child. Girls should have the AM ending and boys should have the UM ending. Of course, priests didn't always fill this out, and sometimes their handwriting is so messy you don't really know whether they wrote an A or a U. But if you are confused, that can be a great clue. Okay, so we have Gertrude, who was born this day. Here, this means of, and then her father's name. So it looks like her father was Joseph Francis. And then this next line means of the place. So it looks like they lived in Jamaica Plain. We have an actual address of where they lived. And I think because this was the German church, that even though Holy Trinity was located in the South End, this family must have traveled from a little bit further afield to worship here. So she was baptized, she was born of this father and this mother right here, Maria Olga Suttner. And then they repeat the same location for the mother. Then the last bit of important information is the witnesses or the godparents. So here this says Petrini fuerent, which means the godparents were. I apologize. I paused for a little too long. Can you go back, Ginevra? Perfect. So the observanda column is one of my favorite columns. That roughly means notes. And so here in this case, she doesn't have any special notes associated with her record, but if an infant was baptized when they were like in danger of dying, or if someone converted, or if there's any sort of like special circumstance surrounding a record, this will often get recorded there. So I really love, sometimes this gives you an insight into who this person was beyond just their name recorded in this record book. So now I'll sort of briefly explain what to do if the volume that you're looking at is indexed in a separate index volume. So we're looking at this example from St. Michael in Hudson, the baptisms from 1898 to 1914. And you can see in this little paragraph, it says, please consult St. Michael Hudson Index to Baptisms, 1875 to 1910. So the index volume sort of is the index for 2 different volumes from this parish. So what we're going to do is go back up to this volume drop-down menu and find that index volume in the list. So here I have it selected, the index to baptisms. And then that's going to take you to that same chart that we were just looking at. So if you're interested in someone, say, with an R last name, you'll want to look on pages 84 to 87. So you'll go back up here. If we're looking for someone with the last name Rogers, type in 84, hit enter. And when you get to that page, it should tell you, okay, now you're going to go back to page 100 in that other volume. So you'll have to go back up to this volume drop-down menu and find the volume that we were just looking at. So my last example is what to do if you are looking at a book that just doesn't have any physical index. You will be most successful at finding a record in these volumes if you have some idea of when it happened. Otherwise, you may just have to wait until it's available in the searchable database, or if you're really enthusiastic and the volume is not that big, you could look through every page in the volume. So in this example, we're going to look for the baptism of Prosper Clarence Morse, who was born in August 1918. So I'm looking in Our Lady of Victory's Boston baptisms, 1917 to 1920. This was Boston's French and French-Canadian parish. It's also called Notre Dame des Victoires. You can see that there are 106 pages in this book over here. And so it spans this year range of 1917 to 1920. So if we're trying to estimate where the records for August 1918 might appear, I roughly am just going to guess page 50 and see where we are in the book. So you can see I've input 50, and then we're going to hit enter and see what we find. So here we are on page 50. This is January of a new year, but you can see that there isn't any year written on this page. So I'm just going to use the blue arrow up here to page back one page and see if we can figure out exactly where we are in this volume. So page 49 is a lot more helpful. You can see it's really big at the top of this page. We're looking at January 1919. So we're going to have to jump back a few months to get to August 1918. So up here in the page number box, I'm going to type in 39 and hit enter and see how far back 10 pages will take me. I'm just sort of working off of guesswork here to try and find this month in August. So page 39 did happen to be August 1918, and I started paging backwards just one page at a time, trying to get to the beginning of the month to proceed forward systematically, but page 38 turned out to be exactly the page for which I was looking. So here you can see Prosper's record. It looks like his family was from Cambridge. His mother's maiden name was James. So you do have some information about him that you could use to further investigate this family. We even have, again, the address where they lived in Cambridge. So this form is fairly similar to the one we just looked at. It's slightly different. I just wanted with this whole example to show you what kind of problem solving you might have to do when you're using the image-only collection. If we hadn't known that Prosper was born in August, we'd probably have to wait until this volume is available in our searchable collection. So I've spent a lot of time sort of telling you how the image-only collection works because it is a little bit complex, but really we're excited about the searchable collection that should be much easier to use. So the searchable collection should work as all of our regular databases work. You can type a name into the search field and be taken to the page on which it appears. We'll start again from the home page and start by choosing Browse Database A to Z. That will bring us back to this list that we've seen before, and this time we're going to click on the title for Massachusetts Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston records from 1789 to 1920. So we're on the database-specific search page, and this search page is generated specifically for each different database. There are 7 fields on which we would love to index all of our databases. So first name, last name, year, location, record type, and parents or spouses' names. And so it really depends on the source material, whether all of this information is given to us. A few of our older databases weren't initially indexed using that standard. But luckily, this database has a lot of rich information, and so we do have all 7 of those fields available. You can also search by witness names. So if you have an ancestor with a really common last name, say your ancestor's name is John Sullivan, you might struggle to figure out which John Sullivan who, went to church in Boston was your John Sullivan. And so if you know things about their family or their neighbors, sort of the community in which these people lived, searching on witness names really can sort of narrow down and distinguish one John Sullivan from another. So to search a witness name, use these family member fields and don't change this drop-down menu, just leave it at any. So here I have an example for you. We're going to look for Margaret Quigley, who lived in Somerville between 1910 to 1915. And when you're filling out the search form, we always suggest sort of starting with a really broad search and gradually making it more specific. So I'm not going to fill out every single thing I know about Margaret Quigley. I'm going to keep it broad and see what I find. And, if you got too many results, then you could refine your search and maybe add another piece of information like her father's name or her spouse's name to make it a little bit more specific. So if we hit search, now you can see we have a few different records, actually quite a lot up here that belong to Margaret Quigley, but it looks like these are all probably the woman for whom we're looking. We have a First Communion record, a confirmation record. We'll talk about this church record in a minute, but I was really looking for her marriage record that happened in 1913. So we're going to click on her name, and that will bring us to the record display page. The record display page is sort of this place that we want to collate all the information about a record for you. We have our transcription of the record, how we've interpreted her name and the names associated with it, what volume it comes from. So this transcription can be really helpful if you're struggling with the handwriting. You can sort of have a second opinion of how did we interpret it. Also, we haven't necessarily gotten it right. We do our best to try really hard to have it be correct, but there is definitely room for error. So if you come across a transcription that you think is incorrect, feel free to either use our report error button or our question and comment box to send an email. So this will get sent to webmaster@nehgs.org, and it's often me who answers those questions. So we're always happy to improve typos or information in our database to be able to offer a more correct record. So we're going to go to view image right here, and then we're going to actually see the page. So the whole point of our transcription is really to connect you with that original document. We want you to be looking at the original document and making your own assumptions and readings of the record. So Margaret's record is this huge paragraph in the middle of the page. And it starts with this oath. Her husband, N. Paul, is not Catholic. And so he is signing this oath that says that he is promising to respect her religion and raise their children Catholic. This is something that appears over and over again when a Catholic marries a non-Catholic. So you'll see these marriage oaths often. And so that when we were looking at the search results page, That's what that church record was representing. And sometimes it's the person themselves who signed the record book. Sometimes it's just a secretary or a record keeper who was writing out the fact that they did sign this oath. And here you can see that this page is much messier than the neat Latin forms that we were looking at before. You sort of have to look through the lines and see here, and Paul and Margaret were married on June 1st. And this word right here, testibus, is another word for witness. So these were the people who witnessed the marriage. And then the pen gets a little faint, but then they list the parents for both of these people and the fact that they had a dispensation because of their mixed religion. So I really wanted to show you an example of this where the record keeping is not as neat, and it's a little harder to just skim. You're going to have to pick through it. So every book is different. You never know what you're going to find. So that was all things based around the searchable database. I didn't spend quite as long explaining it to you because it's much easier to search than the image-only database. Now we're going to quickly dive into the St. Augustine Cemetery records that, again, we created to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the chapel and cemetery. So it was established in 1818 to be the final resting place of Father Francis Matignon, one of the pioneering figures who helped establish the Catholic Church in Boston. This database contains a mix of original records and copied volumes that include lot sales, burials, deaths, and gravestone inscriptions. There may be some overlapping content between these different volumes. So here I have an example from one of the gravestone inventory volumes. This was created during a preservation study of the cemetery that was undertaken in the 1980s. So the front of each of these forms contains information about the physical gravestone, while on the back they offer transcriptions of the gravestone. So if you click the next page, you'll see what was actually written on Mary Callahan's grave. And this is an example from the lot sales volume. I just wanted to show you how wildly different the content of this database could be. So, this page, it looks like it was actually written in 1845. So our databases can be a great place to start your research, continue your research. They're going to have these sacramental records. But obviously that's not the whole story of your ancestors' life as they were living in Boston or Eastern Massachusetts. So I have just a few resources where you could consult to learn more about the history of Catholics. As a companion website to this whole project, we launched catholicrecords.americanancestors.org in 2017 with our press conference. And it sort of has this essay about early Catholicism in Massachusetts. There's a few different sidebars that have other interesting facts or information about how this project works. So if you scroll down on this page, you'll get to my favorite section, which is the timeline of the early church in Greater Boston. And so here, this slider bar, you can see if you start in 1780, you're not going to have all of these little pins on the map. There, it's maybe only going to be Holy Cross, the cathedral, and then as you slide it forward, all of these pins are going to appear of which churches were established when. And so it's also another visual representation of the geographical scope of the Archdiocese. We also have a subject guide on New England Catholic records available in the education, sort of the learn drop-down menu of our website. And so this can maybe fill in a few gaps that maybe I didn't get to in this presentation. And it can also be a helpful resource for, sort of summarizing some of the things that we have talked about. Another really helpful resource is going to be the website of the Archdiocese of Boston Archives. So if you have questions for them, you can contact them here. But they also have this list of ethnic parishes where if your ancestors were not Irish Catholic, maybe they were French Canadian or Portuguese, etc., you can have that list of which parishes were created by those different groups of people. The parish establishment dates that are chronological or by location are also helpful, so you can understand if your ancestor lived here during this time period, what church was there that they might have gone to. And then we're going to look at the archival images, which is a fairly new thing that they're doing and is kind of exciting. So if you click there, you'll get taken to their Flickr page. And so they have been digitizing images from their archives and making them available online. All of these here you can see are different historical photos of churches. They have a few other photos that can be helpful, so they're going to keep adding to this Flickr page. Another institution that is really helpful for researching Catholic and Irish Catholic history is Boston College. And so this is their Global Boston website, which is a digital project that, according to their description, chronicles the history of immigration to Greater Boston since the early 19th century. They examine different time periods, ethnic groups, places of settlement. So especially as this project has moved into phase 2, I have found this website really helpful to understand who was living where and where they were coming from. Boston College's Special Collections Library, the John J. Burns Library, also has strong collections that focus on Catholicism and Irish Americans. So if you go up here to the Find menu, you can access their digital collections where they have some digital material available. So we were talking about the St. Augustine Cemetery, and if you are specifically interested in that and think that you might have family there, you're also going to want to look at this manuscript, which is part of the Thomas Murray family papers. So he was the sexton at the chapel, and this is a list of people who were buried in the cemetery. I haven't yet done the research to see how this compares to our database, but I hope to soon, and I think that this is definitely a really helpful resource. And they also have a lot of newspapers from the Boston area that are digitized, including Catholic newspapers. So the Pilot, of course, is the official newspaper of the Archdiocese of Boston, and they have a few different issues that have been digitized. So that could also be a great way to learn more about the history of your Catholic ancestors. Again, I want to kind of quickly go through this section of how does the project work. So we've talked about how to search it, but how does it get online in the first place? First, we scan the volumes, and once a whole parish is scanned, it can become part of the image-only collection. Some of the books that come to us are not completely ready to be scanned when they arrive. So we have really knowledgeable, dedicated volunteers in our in-house conservation lab who can help us mend tattered edges of the pages or take apart books that are already coming apart so that they can be safely scanned. And then they create these clamshell boxes to send the books back to the Archdiocese in a compact, safe environment. Then, to make things available as part of the searchable collection, we have volunteers and a vendor who work to look at those digitized images and put that information into a spreadsheet. And as I've mentioned, we really try to make this a process that has a few different checks for quality control. We have one volunteer who indexes it, another one who proofreads it, then I look at it one more time before it goes on our website. So our volunteers do an enormous amount of work for us. In 2019, we had 130 volunteers who worked on this project and donated more than 9,000 hours. If you were interested in becoming a volunteer, please get in contact with my colleague, Rachel Adams. You can see her email address right here. And if you are interested in working with Catholic Records in Boston, we are currently working on this project that hasn't officially been announced, the Catholic Cemetery Association. So it hasn't officially been announced because we're still trying to figure out the scope and what is contained within this project. But you would be looking at these lists of burials or lot sales. It's a list of names, and they might have their age and where in the cemetery that they were buried. And so Rachel can send you sample images and tell you more about how all of this works. If you have specialized knowledge in Polish language, Lithuanian language, the French language, if you have ancestors who come from those areas, we'd also be particularly interested in your skills for indexing and proofreading some of the sacramental records. So this project is ever changing. We're always adding new material every week, and every month we try to add something new. How can you know which parishes are available and in which database? We have a blog. So here it's called Database News, and whenever we add something new, we announce it on this blog. So if you're wondering if the parish that you're interested in is available, try typing it in to search this site, and that should pull up the blog post for when it was announced, and that'll tell you whether it's available in the image only or the searchable database, or if nothing comes up, maybe it's not available yet. If you would like to subscribe to this blog and get emails every time we announce something new, you can put your email address in here. And this is about everything that we do on the database team. So you can see that our latest post was about early New England families. So it's not just specific to the Catholic Records Project. I've covered a lot today. I hope that you have a better understanding of how to search these collections, where to find what you're interested in, what life might have been like for your Catholic ancestor in Eastern Massachusetts. Our takeaways really are that we're adding to these databases all the time, and that we really encourage you to sort of look around and read about the history of the parish or the neighborhood that your ancestor lived in. You never know where you're going to find that piece of information that's going to help you break down a brick wall.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Molly. That was fantastic. Let's see if you have any questions. Go ahead and type them into the questions panel, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the next few minutes. So Carol says, this project is amazing, but are there any plans to do this with maybe the Worcester Archdiocese? I mean, are there plans either for Worcester or for other Catholic archdioceses that we should know about?
Right now, we do not have any plans to work with other dioceses, although we would love to. We have reached out to them and sort of, tried to gauge interest. I know that in Worcester, all of the sacramental records still live in the churches that they pertain to. They don't have a centralized archive like the Archdiocese of Boston does. So I think there's some logistical hurdles to working with a few of the other dioceses in the Massachusetts area. So the short answer is we would love to work with more, but nothing has worked out quite yet.
All right, thank you. Now, Martha asks, do you have suggestions for or resources on how to figure out which church your ancestor attended? I know that I think it was the bostoncatholic.org /archives. You had some resources there. Any suggestions if you know that your ancestor was Catholic, living in the Boston area during this time period, must have attended a church? How might you go about figuring out what parish or what church they may have gone to?
That is a great question. And I'll try and give some answer. It can be a little bit of an art to figure out where they lived and where they attended. So really understanding the neighborhood that your ancestor lived in and what churches were close to that neighborhood. Again, that Global Boston website that I mentioned often will say, oh, in the 1900s, the Italians who lived in the South End went to Our Lady of Pompeii. So sometimes they might give you that information. 100 Years of Progress often tells you exactly what corner of the city or what town, part of a town, a specific church was located in. I know that in database news, when we announce something new, if some churches are just in a town. St. Bernard in Concord, I think, is in Concord, and that's the Catholic Church option there. But others may have a few different churches. So I try and specifically say, oh, this was the French Canadian church there, or this one was located in this part of the town. So you never know. Like sometimes people moved around. It's not always easy to pin down, but just trying to research where exactly specifically they lived and what churches might have been there is a great place to start.
All right, thank you. PJ asks about kind of the Latin names that were used. Is there any kind of cheat sheet? PJ says, I know that my grandparents were married in the church, but their first names are foreign. And so far I'm not getting any matches. So, is there kind of a cheat sheet to understanding the Latinized names? And if your ancestor's name is, slightly different or unusual, how might you go about searching?
So by providing both the Latin that is specifically written on the page and an anglicized alternative, we're trying to make it so that maybe you don't need a cheat sheet. Obviously, when we're providing that alternative, we're making a guess at what their name might be, and so that could be something that we have gotten wrong. My best suggestion would be to use some wildcards. So say your ancestor's name begins with an A, and then the rest of it might have been recorded incorrectly by the record taker. If you search for A asterisk in our database in that first name field, that might be a great way to come up with, you're going to have to limit your search. Maybe you want all the people whose first name begins with A with this last name in this time period in this location, because if you don't limit it, everyone who begins with an A is a lot of records. So that might be one way to try and look for it. Again, if you have an idea of the specific time period and the specific parish, you could maybe do a little bit of flipping through the pages to see what you find. That's a really tricky thing, and we're always trying to figure out how to make people more accessible to find.
And we have a few questions kind of pertaining to like burial records, funeral records, deaths. You don't see a lot of those in the sacramental records that we have in our collection. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit? Are there maybe other sources if someone is looking for either burial or funeral records where they might look for those?
So as Ginevra mentioned, this really varies by parish. There's a few parishes who might have a deaths or burials volume, but for the most part, they do not. And some of this is going to be covered in our upcoming project with the Catholic Cemetery Association. It's my understanding that Catholic cemeteries were administered in one of 3 different ways. So the Catholic Cemetery Association is associated with the Archdiocese of Boston, and they administer about 25 cemeteries in the region. There's other cemeteries that are specifically associated with a parish, and so those records would probably be found at that parish. And then there's other private Catholic cemeteries that we do not have any plans to work with at this time, and you would have to contact them specifically. So unfortunately, there's no one centralized answer to how to find burial records, but maybe between those different ways, you'll be able to find your ancestor.
All right. And Edward asks, are there missing parishes? I do not see Wakefield included, for example.
Yes, we are still working to get this all together. Some of it might depend on the time period, and then Thomas, who's the archivist at the Archdiocese, is also still collecting books from different parishes. So if something is missing, it might be because he doesn't yet have those books in his archive. So that would be a case where if we don't have it in our thing, if it's 1901 to 1920, that phase 2, you'd probably want to talk to me and I could say, oh, it's coming up, we're going to get to that. But if you think it should already be there and it's not, you might want to be in contact with Thomas and say, I'm looking for these records. Do you have any insight into why they might not be part of this project right now?
All right, and I know that there are a number of questions about asking if there's an archives or a central location for other archdioceses across Massachusetts, across New England. The subject guide that Molly referenced, it's Catholic Resources in New England. It does have a PDF listing all of the archdioceses across New England, and if an archives exists, their contact information. So I'll be including a link to that subject guide in my follow-up email. But unfortunately, it looks like that's all the time we have for today. I hope you enjoyed today's session and learned a lot. Of course, this session has been recorded. You'll be able to go back and review any of the content, and you will get an email from me shortly with some more information on accessing that link, as well as some other resources, some of the links that we included, like the subject guide, and links directly to the two databases as well. So thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. So I hope to see you at our online programs in the future, and goodbye for now.